Hello everybody, my name is Elona Pojani and I am a lecturer at the Department of Finance, University of Tirana, Albania. This webinar aim is to give you an introduction to the financial strategies and instruments for disaster risk management, which aim is to contribute to the financial resilience of a country. I will discuss today on the impacts of a disaster and their connection to macroeconomic indicators. Then I will give a short overview of market, non-market and intertemporal disaster risk transfer instruments. This webinar is aimed at those that are new to the area and want to understand the basic concepts behind the financial resilience strategy that a country might adopt. It assumes no prior knowledge on this topic, but attendees should have some basic concepts related to economy and finance. The webinar will provide easy-to-understand concepts and is aimed to be used either by students or professionals working or studying in the field of disaster risk management. Disasters seriously impact the economic performance of developing countries and the livelihood of millions of people around the world. Although the capital losses in developing countries might be smaller in absolute terms when compared to those in developed countries, their relative weight and overall impact tend to be very significant, even affecting sustainability. Some of the main reasons behind this include infrastructure conditions and lower building standards, absent or poor incentives for mitigation strategies, underdevelopment of private markets, which do not provide adequate disaster risk transfer instruments, greater constraints on government resources available to cope with disasters. In addition, in these countries, often the mentality imposes a further burden to the implementation of disaster risk management practices. This includes the mentality of governments, which often develop short-run strategies corresponding to the election cycle, the mentality of the private sector, which develop their activity focused on short-term profit, without taking into account any damages imposed to the environment and infrastructure, and the mentality of the population, which do not consider insurance or other risk transfer instruments as a risk protection technique. Developing of disaster risk management strategies is indispensable, although it requires strong incentives by the government, businesses and households. Also, an appropriate evaluation of the costs of disaster is necessary to guide the decision-making process. Today, much pressure is imposed to our planet. Much of this comes from the growing of human population. Climate change is a further challenge which has impacted public policies all over the world. As the future is unknown, also other challenges might arise to humanity. All these affect development of disaster risk management strategies. Public sector resilience toward hazards is determined by the efficiency and effectiveness of disaster management policies. The direct, indirect and secondary costs caused by disasters, the individual's behavior and awareness level on disaster risk, and finally the economic resilience level. Staying on the last concept, the ability of the public sector to respond to a disaster event is often referred to as economic resilience. The economic resilience is conditioned by all the possible internal and external resources available to the government to respond to the event, such as the insurance and reinsurance payments, the reserve funds that the country has available, the funds that may be received as aid and donations, the value of new taxes that the country could issue in case of disasters, the margin for budgetary reallocations that the country can achieve for addressing recovery phase costs, the feasible value of external credit, the internal credit the country may obtain. Access to these resources has limitations and costs that must be taken into account depending on the macroeconomic and financial conditions of the country. Economic impacts of a disaster are usually grouped into three categories: direct, indirect, and macroeconomic effects, often called also secondary effects. Direct economic damages are mostly the immediate damages due to the event per se. A smaller portion of these losses result from the loss of already produced goods. The effects can be divided up into those to the private and public economic sectors. Indirect economic losses occur as a consequence of physical destruction affecting households and firms. Most important indirect economic impacts include diminished production or service due to interruption of economic activity, increased prices, increased costs, and loss or reduction of wages due to the business interruption. It should be kept in mind that the social and environmental consequences also have economic repercussions. Economic impacts of a disaster are usually grouped into three categories: direct, indirect, and macroeconomic effects, often called also secondary effects. Direct economic damages are mostly the immediate damages due to the event per se. A smaller portion of these losses result from the loss of already produced goods. The effects can be divided up into those to the private and public economic sectors. Indirect economic losses occur as a consequence of physical destruction affecting households and firms. Most important indirect economic impacts include diminished production or service due to the interruption of economic activity, increased prices, increased costs, and loss or reduction of wages due to business interruption. It should be kept in mind that the social and environmental consequences also have economic repercussions. The public sector has, in most of the cases, the responsibility to bear the cost of damages caused by a disaster. Therefore, macroeconomic impacts also arise. The disaster will affect different sectors in varying degrees, and thus will be reflected in the macroeconomic performance of the country's economy. Several macroeconomic indicators are affected by a disaster event. These include GDP, agriculture, manufacture and service sector, exports and imports of goods, fixed capital, inflation rate, public financing, and trade balance. The GDP, which is the main indicator, logically will drop in the year of the event. The aftermath often is affected by the ability of public sector to respond to the disaster event through its reconstruction policies. Sometimes the GDP level in the long run might overcome the GDP level before the disaster event, following these strong public policies. We will now discuss financial strategies for disaster risk management. Financial strategies for disaster risk management are intended to ensure that individuals, businesses and governments have the resources necessary to manage the adverse financial and economic consequences of disasters. The analysis of financial exposure of a country to disasters is an important part of disaster risk management strategy. Financial protection will help governments mobilize resources in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, while buffering the long-term fiscal impacts of a disaster. Financial strategy is only one component of a comprehensive disaster risk management strategy, while other components include risk identification and modeling, mitigation policies, preparedness and response system management, and post-disaster reconstruction strategies and plans. This is a representation of a framework based on disaster risk layers, categorizing them into low risk layer, medium risk layer, and high risk layer. This categorization based on frequency of a disaster event and related impacts can be used as a baseline for developing disaster risk reduction and financial strategies. As you can see, the risk financing strategy is very important in case of the medium risk layer and disasters that fall in this category. The main risk management instruments are illustrated in this table. These are categorized according to their approaches and have been divided into non-market risk transfer, market risk transfer, and intertemporal risk transfer. This categorization will be used later in the lecture to describe more thoroughly each instrument. The public sector has in most of the cases the responsibility to bear the cost of damages caused by a disaster. The government plays a key role in loss financing after a disaster in developing and emerging economy countries, and even in high-income countries. Therefore, post-disaster government assistance can be seen as one of the most important arrangements of non-market risk transfer. Household, businesses and governments can transfer their catastrophic risk by insurance and/or reinsurance. In addition to traditional insurance, there is an emerging interest in other alternative risk transfer instruments, such as catastrophe bonds and weather derivatives. Finally, intertemporal risk spreading is another approach for risk management. At the household level, risk spreading over time can be achieved in the form of savings. On the country level, governments can establish catastrophe reserve funds, usually financed by taxes, which are depleted only in the case of a disaster event. Contingent credit arrangements allow borrowing money after an event, whereas the post-event annuity payments are smaller in comparison to a regular credit. Borrowing is also a kind of intertemporal risk spreading of losses, because payments will be made in the future. As one can see, a contingent credit is a mixture of savings and borrowing. Countries generally have access to various sources of financing following a disaster. These sources can be categorized as ex post and ex ante financing instruments. Ex post instruments are sources that do not require advanced planning. This includes budget reallocation, domestic credit, external credit, tax increase, and donor assistance. Often the public sector relies on such ex post financial means, where international assistance has been especially important. Ex-ante disaster risk management practices are considered a crucial part of disaster financing strategy. Ex-ante risk financing instruments require proactive advanced planning and include reserve or calamity funds, budget contingencies, contingent debt facility, and risk transfer mechanisms. Insurance is one of the usual techniques used to transfer the catastrophe risk. The transfer of risk from the individual to the insurance company is carried through a contractual agreement under which the insurance company, in consideration of a premium paid by the insured and his promise to abide to the provisions of the contract, promises to make payment to or on behalf of the insured for losses caused by the perils covered under the contract. The main purpose of the insurance is to indemnify the insured, to restore his financial position prior to the occurrence of the loss. In addition to reducing direct and indirect losses, insurance provides economic security. Insurers cover catastrophic losses through reinsuring their activity, dispersing their coverage over a large area, and finally through financial markets. An insurable risk should fulfill certain requirements. There should be large number of exposure units, loss must be unintentional, accidental, determinable, must not be catastrophic, must be predictable, and the premium must be economically feasible. The loss should not be catastrophic because the pooling technique, which is the essence of insurance, fails. The change of loss is hardly predictable. The law of large numbers can hardly be applied. As the natural disaster risk does not satisfy all the above-mentioned requirements, the insurance companies are not willing to cover all the natural disaster losses by their own. However, despite its advantages, there are several problems of supply and demand side on the insurance market. On the demand side, for low-income households, commercial insurance is not affordable and has high opportunity costs. Many low-income countries are highly exposed to natural disaster risk, and therefore, even fair premiums would be quite high. As a consequence, residents of such countries cannot pay the price for such risk transfers, and therefore require support from the non-risk communities or internationally. On the supply side, insurers are hesitant to promote coverage because of the intrinsic problems of insurability of catastrophe risks, the lack of formal titles to property of firms and individuals in developing countries, without which no formal proof of holdings can be established, and therefore no premium calculations can be done, high transaction costs, and unstable business environments. Hence, in developing countries, instead of insurance, households usually rely on family and public support. The most popular capital market products associated with catastrophic risks are catastrophe bonds, briefly known as cat bonds, however, not this kind of cat bonds. They are issued and traded mainly in the institutional investor marketplace and are similar to a corporate bond. The issuer is usually a city, state, organization, like a reinsurer, exposed to disaster risks. The investors who buy a cat bond will receive a corresponding interest according to the terms of the contract. However, if a catastrophic event set out in the contract occur, bondholders lose the interest they received in the bond and, in some cases, the principal invested. From this point of view, disaster bonds are like a bet that investors put up if disasters of a certain nature are going to happen or not. In exchange for taking this added risk compared to ordinary bonds, investors receive a higher return from disaster bonds. The major buyer of these securities are large institutional investors, such as mutual funds, pension funds, hedge funds, banks, etc. Recently, these funds have made this security also available for individual investors, though in limited quantities. Derivatives today constitute an important part of the financial market. They are financial instruments that have emerged as risk management tools, although they are also used for speculative purposes to increase the returns of different investment portfolios. From the risk management point of view, derivatives are among the key instruments used in financial markets. Derivatives, however, differ from insurance contracts because, in addition to risk hedging, they also provide the opportunity to achieve a certain return, while insurance contracts offer merely protection. The main instruments in the derivative market are option, forward contracts, futures contracts, and swaps. To help your understanding, here is an easy example that will help you easily get the term. Suppose there are two people selling sunglasses and umbrellas, respectively. On rainy days, the person selling sunglasses might lose out. However, under the effect of weather derivative, he can reduce his loss since the person selling umbrellas would pay for his loss instead. The umbrella seller would be repaid from the sunglasses seller later on a sunny day, when he will be suffering a loss. Catastrophe derivatives are financial instruments whose value is affected by the occurrence or not of a disaster set out in the contract. Like in the sunglasses umbrella example, disaster derivatives work basically on a contract according to which one party, the seller of the contract, pays to the other party, the contract buyer, one monetary value if a condition related to the occurrence of a catastrophic event is met and damages arise. Also, these derivatives can take the form of swaps, where parties exchange between them the different risk exposures. The market for both disaster derivatives as well as cat bonds is a relatively new market and has yet to reach that level of development that can be termed as mature. Here are represented some of the main features of both instruments. As highlighted before, governments and donor assistance are usually the most widely used ex-post disaster relief measures. This is particularly the case for vulnerable countries. Even the insurance system is often unable to meet the needs in case of disaster of high-layer losses, even in high-income economies, unless they can rely on public backup in the form of government guarantees. New taxes, budgetary reallocation toward rehabilitation and reconstruction activities, and exploitation of reserve funds might be sources of financing for the government in these cases. However, such instruments, despite not having a financial expense in the form of commission or interest payment, bear a very high opportunity cost, as such funds could have been used for other national purposes. In addition, new taxes pose a high burden to the public, which is usually skeptical of the use of such measure. Nevertheless, government funds are usually limited and cannot bear the cost of major disaster events. In such cases, international assistance may come to their rescue. Bilateral and multilateral assistance may take the form of reimbursable or non-reimbursable financing. In some cases, the refinancing or forgiving of past debts. Bilateral and multilateral assistance may take the form of reimbursable or non-reimbursable financing, and, in some cases, the refinancing or forgiving of past debts. However, there are several shortcomings when international assistance is considered. Firstly, foreign aid is not always immediately available, nor does it always come in the form that would be required by the particular country at a time of a crisis. International aid is frequently in kind. This might be a disadvantage, as the goods received may not be necessarily the ones that are most urgently needed, and because dealing with in-kind aid uses scarce resources during the emergency, which could be used for other more important purposes. Finally, the availability of ex-post financing tends to create bad incentives, as governments may prefer to depend on these foreign resources rather than create a proactive disaster risk management strategy. When savings, credit, and government support are not forthcoming, at-risk individuals in developing countries traditionally rely on financial arrangements that involve reciprocal exchange, kinship ties, and community self-help. This arrangement might be inappropriate for high-layer covariate risk, where whole families and regions may be affected, but could be very effective for low and medium-layer risks. Public disaster programs can work in two forms, which may or may not be related to the insurance activity. In the case of public disaster programs, the scheme works more or less as an insurance scheme, with specifics or changes ranged depending on the state or type of coverage. In the case of disaster funds, the schemes resemble more with a contingency fund, which is activated in case of catastrophic nature. Using one or the other form is related to the nature of disasters that may hit a country, especially their severity and the financial ability of the country's government that has to deal with them. The first form involves the pooling of risk with a focus on the coverage type and the specific area. Programs work as state insurance at affordable prices and often mandatory. Such programs curb the private insurance industry, because individuals with state guarantee tend to get less private insurance, or not at all, thus revealing a form of moral risk. The economies of small developing countries are the ones most affected by disasters. Regardless of the measures that may be taken by the governments of these countries, the size of the economy itself, the underdeveloped insurance market, and the lack of culture of the insured made it difficult to finance the cost of disasters. The idea behind regional insurance pools is that the risk is distributed to more areas and people. In addition to the disaster-related part, the above-mentioned program also plays a significant role in propagating disaster risk mitigation and public education. Regional disaster funds are also considered solution for other wider areas of population. This practice is followed by the Caribbean countries, which are often hit by hurricanes. Another major project in this context, similar to that of the Caribbean, is thought to be applied in Southeast Europe and Caucasus area. As an instrument for intertemporal risk transfer, contingent credit gives the right to take out a specific loan amount post-event that has to be repaid and contractually fixed conditions. despite its ability to provide fast financial resources to meet the emergency needs and to provide the government with lower cost capital relative to either insurance or the accumulation of reserves, its major disadvantage is that it can also exacerbate a country's debt burden. Funds to be used in case of a disaster event could be accumulated by making annual deposits to a reserve fund. There is a risk with the reserve fund that the other arrangements do not exhibit. The risk of depletion of a reserve fund is relatively high, particularly in capital-scarce economies, where it has been observed that such funds are depleted once there is a need for financing of other important issues. Alternatively, through development funds, financing activities for mitigation and prevention purposes, which lead to the reduction of vulnerability, can be achieved. Finally, microfinance and savings instruments provide financial services to low-income individuals. In this last part of this webinar, we will address the issue of climate change and its implication with disaster risk management strategies. Climate change is expected to increase risk to businesses, infrastructure, assets, and economies. Climate change is expected to impact several sectors and living conditions of humanity. Some of the impacts include increase of weather disasters, worsening of public water supply and drinking water, biodiversity loss, loss of agricultural production, loss of forestry yield, increased demand for energy, for heating and cooling, change of tourism and recreation demand, worsening of health conditions. Therefore, strategies for disaster risk management should include climate change modeling. Apart from disaster risk financial means, there are further financial strategies targeting directly climate change. A decentralized approach to innovative financing, focusing on taxation, development-based charges, entry fees, and small-scale enterprises and initiatives taken at the local level between the private sector, government authorities, and NGOs, has to be adopted. Here, some of the main financing instruments and their respective field of action is presented. Concluding this webinar and following these last thoughts on climate change, I want to emphasize again how disaster risk finance is a challenging issue, especially in developing countries, and how the implementation of a financing strategy requires careful planning in terms of modeling and pricing uncertainties, institutional stability, public confidence and trust, moral hazard, adverse selection, and basis risk. Thank you all for your attention.